All right, everybody. Can somebody just confirm that you can see me and hear me okay? Great. Thank you, Paul. Hello, everybody. It's good to be back hosting another CelloChat relatively soon after my last one, although I think we'll probably take today in a slightly different direction. Wanted to start by mentioning the launch on Cello Bello. Either this weekend or maybe tomorrow is when the classes go live of Cello Kids, which is an incredible new section of the Cello Bello website and experience, and specifically geared toward young folks from 4 to 6, from ages 7 to 9. Separate experiences for both of those age groups that connect them with teachers and resources, best of what's around at this time when we are all a little more separated physically than we're used to being. So this is, it's been in the pipeline for a while, but this is actually a very timely and sort of amazing thing to have in our cello landscape right at the moment. So cellobello.org/cellokids will take you right there for everything you need to know. I wanted to start by just talking very briefly before we get to questions about something that I've been thinking about recently and sort of had a couple of what you might call realizations, and that is breathing. Some of you may have heard more about it recently or been thinking more about it recently. Folks who are, obviously it's a basic human need, but as we all sort of find our own ways to deal with the anxiousness that's in the air right now over the future, anybody who's versed at all in yoga or meditation practices or Feldenkrais disciplines or Alexander technique, all of these are things that have as a part of them an awareness of breathing. And I've been thinking about how the discussion of breathing often comes up in cello lessons, and normally there's not really time to discuss it. And oftentimes it takes the form of the teacher noticing that the student is either holding their breath or perhaps taking tiny little shallow breaths, at the very top of the lungs rather than breathing more deeply. And oftentimes the issue in the lesson is just addressed as the teacher reminding the student to breathe. And that's a good thing, and it often releases some held tension that might be there. But often the discussion stops there. And I guess in my own life, I've become aware of breathing in a more and more, to me, sort of complete sense. And it's very interesting when we start to draw parallels between breathing and cello playing. Why? Because breathing, or thinking about breathing, puts us immediately in touch with something that we can control and something we cannot control. When we're asleep at night, we're obviously not controlling our breathing consciously. So there's that sort of dichotomy between being able to think about it and do something consciously and not. And if we think about it, there are tremendous parallels to cello playing and to our habits at the instrument. We have teaching and we learn how to play and we develop a certain set of habits that are actually sort of unconscious. We do them without really thinking about them. And so part of getting better and becoming more aware of ourselves as players inevitably involves starting to become aware of the things that we do without thinking about it. And then we can ask ourselves, well, is this something that I would choose if I had the choice, or is this something that I'm doing that's getting in my own way that I would not choose, and therefore I would like to change that habit. And I think we would all agree that the way to change a habit that is unconscious, the only way to change those habits is by going through some period of time where we give them conscious thought. And that is why breathing is such a sort of important thing, because if we leave it to the unconscious, we get stuck with or reap the benefits of whatever we happen to be doing without thinking about it. So it's interesting too, in the disciplines I mentioned earlier, Feldenkrais doesn't talk specifically about how to breathe. Basically, the idea there is that we want to be able to breathe in different ways at different times and in different situations. And I think that's a nice way to look at it, because it doesn't actually imply any kind of rigid dogma about breathing deeply or breathing shallow or what have you. So I like the idea of giving myself a choice and experimenting with different ways to breathe. That is where the science comes in, which I've actually only recently sort of become aware of through my own experience attempting to recover from an injury. And just very briefly, it is scientifically true that if we breathe sort of from the very top of our lungs, just taking what we would consider shallow sips of air sort of from here up, that type of breathing stimulates the autonomic nervous system, which is basically our fight or flight reflex. It keys everything up and gives us a rush of adrenaline. It's deeply wired into us, as though we're, about to have to escape from a tiger that's around the corner. So of course we hide and we're as still as possible, and we take tiny little shallow breaths, and we end up getting more and more keyed up for whatever the situation is. So how many of us, when we're standing backstage before a performance, a solo performance that's making us a little nervous, might be breathing that way and unconsciously actually enhancing the feeling of being frightened of what we're about to do. On the other hand, breathing from deeper inside our gut, what's called diaphragmatic breathing. Singers know all about this, but I'm learning that other instrumentalists do not. Being able to use the deep muscles lower down in the body to breathe stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the system that makes us feel calm, safe, everything that we might want to feel before a performance. So I read these things, and I actually tried them, and my own physical experience trying them is that it is true. And there is an immediate effect of how we breathe on how the body feels. And I invite all of you to try that. Is the idea that we should always then breathe in a way that makes ourselves feel safe and calm and take the deepest possible breaths? Not necessarily, but if we give ourselves the choice of being able to breathe that way, which until recently I would say that I actually didn't know what diaphragmatic breathing was, what it meant to take a really deep breath from the gut. To me, a deep breath meant sort of starting here and filling my lungs up with air, but that's a different thing from breathing from down further. The easiest way for those of you who are new to this, like I was, to get the diaphragm involved in breathing is to feel like our nostrils are sort of right below our navel. So if you can imagine taking a breath, starting from there, then your gut fills up first, and then it feels like the air sort of fills you up this way. And then obviously we can let the air out. So a few of those breaths has a marked effect one way on the body, whereas a few of the the shallow sort of quicker breaths from here up has a completely different effect on the body. So if we want to change the way we are able to breathe, giving a little bit of conscious thought to the choices we have is only going to be a good thing. Then before you know it, you sit down and you pick up the cello and you're aware of your breath moving in and out, and then you're aware of how your breath is moving in and out. And I'll be the first to admit I went through, years of my life and even my professional career where, not that I was holding my breath because I was aware of my breath based on what I was told by my teachers, but I didn't choose to be aware of it in a very detailed way. So, through a little bit of conscious thought, we give ourselves choices, and that's exactly what we want to do with our cello technique. We don't really only want to have one way to do something, and it's by experimenting with what really works and sort of exploring options that we can arrive at our best, most honest physical language to use at the cello. All right. I see there's a couple questions coming in now, so let's end that discussion. But I did want to say that because that's something that's been on my mind quite a bit, even while trying to take walks outside. It's a great time to just sort of be aware of how we use our body. From a breathing standpoint, from a walking standpoint even. This is all good stuff. And now that the world has slowed down a little bit temporarily, it seems maybe a good time to think about some of these more esoteric issues. Great. Let's move on here. Oh, Cecilia's here. How are you? Thank you for that comment. There was one more up here from the YouTube live audience. I've been working on breathing with my students and leaning. You are so right. How do we turn on the mechanism for them? That is a great question. And I suppose it depends on the age of the student. Like most things can depend a lot on the age of the student. If we're talking about high school, college age, then obviously adults can be aware of their bodies in a way that results from just being given the information, sort of as I just did now. Kids, on the other hand, maybe we can get something up on Cello Kids that addresses this. They tend to work better with images and adjectives, and actually the idea of having your nose be way down here on your belly and just trying to take a breath in from your navel rather than from your nose is, I imagine that would be fun for a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old to try. I guess one of the issues that comes up in teaching sometimes is that a lesson is a relatively short period of time. And I've been thinking also, I haven't done it yet, but it might actually be useful. And maybe if anybody listening knows whether this is true, it's probably a cello teacher somewhere that has codified or put together some sort of concise method of exercises for breathing in printed form or online, something like that. So I don't think we need to have 1,000 exercises. I think a few basic ones actually go a long way toward developing that awareness. So, but since I'm just sort of exploring this newly for myself again, I would not say that I'm the expert in necessarily how to teach it to others, other than just to give them information based on personal experience. So if you've experienced the benefits of breathing a particular way, then of course we can share that with our students and have them try it and hopefully feel that benefit themselves. The good news is the effect is usually immediate when you choose different ways to take air in and out of the lungs. I don't know if children are generally considered too young to meditate. Even just for a minute, I bet we could get kids to meditate for 1 minute or 2 minutes and to just focus on their breathing without even trying to change it. Then you're just developing the awareness, and then later you can expand on that. So There's a few ideas about that. Next one here is from James. Dal, what are good exercises to develop feeling of arm weight in bow arm? Good question. I guess let me give you the shortest version of this that I can. Obviously, there's a basic sense of arm weight that we can develop without even having the cello. It might even be better to develop without even having the cello, which is, let's make bow weight feel like real life. Hold your arm up, let the hand be loose, and then imagine, sort of simulate the feeling of just sort of dropping the arm down, feeling what that weight feels like. Then it's possible, while holding the cello and holding a bow up, to have that feeling be quite similar. So I suppose the first step in developing the feeling of bow weight is just to make sure that the student or ourselves understands that there need not be any sense of suspension necessarily in developing the feeling of just putting the arm weight down on the string. Of course, we have to refine that when we play, because if we put all of our arm weight down, often that results in crunching the sound. And I will have my students crunch the sound on purpose just to understand the power of their own arm. So once we get any extra holding out of the picture, then we can start moving the bow across the string, and then we start dealing with things that are a little bit more nuanced, just meaning what parts of the arm are we using to draw the bow to different parts of the stick, the tip or the frog. Let me just give this question one more minute. This is an important thing, and I know let's leave it at this, which is we can, at the frog is when we can feel the idea of bow weight, arm weight most directly. When we start to move the bow out, sorry, you may not be able to see the bow. Let me just move this down. We can use our whole arm in terms of weight. I'm crunching the sound a little bit here. Until about halfway out in the bow, and then we have a choice. I can reach the tip doing nothing other at this point than just extending my forearm. And this is something I encourage you to try. I can do it, but it feels absolutely terrible. It feels like I have no power. There's no way I would be able to play, let alone play fortissimo at this point. You can't see my hand, but I hope you got the idea. And so, what's the solution? Well, it's experimenting with ways to direct the arm weight into the bow, and that has to change as we pass the halfway point. And the upper arm has to stay involved in some way so that when we reach the tip, we feel like we have power and control out here. So the upper arm might be higher, likely will be higher than it would be if I just reach the tip by extending my arm out this way. But it's better. So it does take a certain amount of experimentation, and in terms of exercises, I punt on this question so often because any exercise, anytime you put the bow on the string, it's an opportunity to practice this. So you would be just as good as I am about choosing an etude or something slow and sustained that you could feel the bow weight directly in the string, and then the way that it transfers as we move out to the tip and back. So hope that helps. Another from YouTube Live, are there exercises you use to practice controlling your breathing at the cello? Yes. One of the things that we can do, actually speaking of bow weight, we could combine these two. I learned this from my teacher, Mr. Starker. It starts without the cello, and you just begin by filling your lungs from the bottom and dividing them into certain parts. So we can breathe in. It's sort of like the concept of what's called square breathing. So you breathe in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts. Or you could breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. But the idea is that you're regulating your breathing, you're making it regular and even. And then we can pick up the cello and we can do the same with the bow. So as we breathe in for 4 counts, we use the bow for those 4 counts, so that as we fill up our lungs, we use 1 whole bow. Then we exhale for 4 counts and we bring the bow back this way for 4. So basically what we're doing is regulating something. We're making it very even. Our breathing is liable to not be quite as regular, and certainly our bow use deliberately is not going to be as regular because we're going for different colors and sounds, and we're constantly changing our use of the bow. But that doesn't mean that there is no value in knowing exactly how to use it very smoothly and evenly. So once that is working, then you can divide your lungs into 8 parts. And then eventually, I've never done more than 16, but you can sort of, again, divide your lungs and sort of sip bits of air that take 16 full counts and use that on 1 bow going down and 1 bow going up. If you do that just a few times, sort of the discipline and the what's the word? The regulated quality of that, then if we start to move a little bit more freely, it's definitely with a renewed sense of understanding and the relationship of taking air in more quickly, for example, or using the bow more quickly. So that's the one that I know of, and I know that it works. All right. Jackie says, having just gone through a migraine, it amazes me how well deep breathing helps with tension. Oh my goodness, I could do another whole chat about this, about various types of chronic pain. Anyway, yes, let's leave it at that, and I'm glad that breathing is helpful to you for migraines. Seiko here says, I'm currently working on Alexander technique, which is similar. Tension issues after practicing incorrectly for nearly 10 years. Could I give advice on releasing tension on the left arm? I've been working on releasing the thumb, but still have difficulty, especially while working on sight reading or new material. Thank you for that question. This is maybe relates back, I don't know if you were here right at the beginning of the chat, but it relates back to the idea of giving ourselves a choice, and when we have a habit that we want to ingrain in our playing, to find time to give it conscious thought, so that when we are working on sight reading or new repertoire, and we can't obviously give conscious thought to our breathing and our where our feet are on the ground, and our we want to develop just as many good habits as possible that are there in our playing without thinking about it. So as far as the left arm goes, there's just like we were talking about in the bow a minute ago, there's a basic feeling of using gravity that is always going to be useful. What is it that's making me able to press the string down? Is it that I'm squeezing the thumb and clamping down with the fingers like we do so often in real life? No. So this is a hard one hard habit to break, because we reach out and grab things like this all the time. We have this thumb. I heard a wonderful class by Marcy Rosen. I think it was on Cello Bello. And she said something that she put it in such a wonderful way, that she thinks of our thumbs as not fingers, but as extensions of the arm. Think about it, it's actually true. These are the fingers. The thumb functions much more as an extension of the arm, particularly in thumb position, but also down here, and also on this side. Fingers are up here. The thumb feels more like part of the arm. So it's just an interesting sort of take on how to think about it. So I think above all, we want to get a sense of where the power of gravity helps and where the limits of that power are. Because obviously if we just hang off the fingerboard, our arm might actually not find the ideal position of balance if we include the thumb. But a lot of it actually is that. It also helps to know from a finger standpoint, to talk a little bit about finger action. How do we put fingers down? Do we place them down really slowly, Ideally not. Do we mash them down and hold them down? No. So the happy medium, it's like Goldilocks. The happy medium between those two is a distinct and authoritative drop, which then activates the string and releases the rest of the hand. The previous playing finger is released, vibrato motion is started, and so there's a wonderful lightness that can be developed in the hand by experimenting with the right motion to put our fingers down. If I crawl like this, it's so easy for tension to just be in there and never be released. I hope you can see that okay. But also I'm not mashing fingers down and grabbing this way. So you want to spend some time finding this beautiful way. Paul Katz, I believe, used to call it a ping. There's like this ping motion and even a sound when the fingers go down. Then the other component obviously is making sure that our shoulder is not raised and is not bent forward this way, having a neutral shoulder. And then I guess one other bit is just finding the natural place for our arm where the energy comes straight through and you feel like it's not broken by the wrist. We don't necessarily want it to be as low as possible because that's not natural. But obviously, this doesn't look right either. So we can see the connection between something that looks good, something that feels good, and ultimately something that's going to sound good. So search for, above all, naturalness when you have time to work on this. And, whoops. Did we go away? Sorry about that. I think... hang on. There we go. Here, we're back. Sorry about that. I had an errant microphone. Okay, here we are. So that was essentially the end of that. Are we back? Let me make sure that we're back. Yes, I think we are. The screen seems frozen here. Let me just refresh it. Let me find my place in the questions here. Sorry about that. Okay. My screen seems frozen, but I'm assuming that you can all see me again. Actually, can you let me know if you can see me again and hear me before I go on? Okay, good, thank you. My screen is frozen, but that doesn't matter. All right, I hope that helps with the left arm. Stephen Grant, as cellists, we are always looking to develop our own unique sound. What are some of the ways you practice extracting a core tone and expanding a diverse color palette? Okay, great question. I suppose I was saying this yesterday or 2 days ago in a cello class, which is that if our ears don't know exactly what we want, our hands are a little bit powerless to try to get that. So I think Paul Katz has a concise way of saying that, and he says the ears are boss, right? This entire process of scratching horsehair across steel doesn't mean much unless we are going for something and something specific. So the more specifically you know how you'd like to sound, your arms are already going to start to do some of the right things as you search for that. So you can take confidence in that. I would say remember that the practice room really is a place for experimentation and sort of to throw caution to the wind a little bit and to ask ourselves some of the, sort of profound questions, which is, what is my unique voice? Whatever piece I'm playing, what is it that's going to set my way of playing this, apart? That's not obviously that's not our guiding artistic principle, but I guess the better way to put it is, how do I want to sound while I'm playing this? Then the other half, sort of comes down to, what are our skills in terms of being able to create the sounds we want? So if we talk about the issues the issues you raise in your question, there are solutions that have to do with conception and solutions that have to do with execution. So we want to make sure we give attention to both, meaning, what's the ideal sound and how do I get that? So you mentioned practicing extracting a core tone, which, again, we were talking earlier about letting arm weight down. The fastest way to get a great core tone is to have good bow habits and to know what those are. So we have our weight, our speed, our contact point, our amount of hair we're using, the angle of the bow on the string, and I know that if all those things are working for me, I can feel the instrument vibrating, and it's this wonderful connection. If I, by contrast, play kind of with a bad angle across the surface of the string, it's a huge exaggeration, but, nothing is coming from the instrument. So I think we're lucky as cellists that we hold the instrument so close to us, because we get such immediate feedback from it against our body. So I hope that's a good answer to your question. Obviously, the wonderful music that we're lucky to be able to play in the repertoire often inspires us to look for a more diverse color palette. I give my students the Debussy Sonata often when we're talking about that, because it's one of many, many wonderful pieces that are kind of force us to hear and to think a little bit outside the normal box of cello playing. Just put the bow on the string and move it back and forth. So it's a combination of those practical skills, but also don't undervalue the role of of your own brain and heart looking for more and more specific and personal ways to express yourself. Good. Beverly says, are you frozen? Oh, do you mean frozen shoulder? If you do, I know what frozen shoulder is, but luckily that's not what's going on for me. Violinists and violists I know tend to have more issues with that, but I know enough to know that it's no fun. Okay, one more from YouTube Live. Could you please discuss the technical aspects of spiccato, and sautier with regards to increasing the level of tempo, how to practice and improve function of the right hand, bow placement, etc. This is covering an entire world. Wow, okay. There's probably not going to be enough time to do this justice, but staccato, spiccato, and sautier. Some teachers teach these terms. Other teachers teach the qualities of the stroke without necessarily calling a stroke sautier. What I can say is that it's incredibly helpful to remember that all of our strokes, whether long or short on the bow, are relatives of a basic legato stroke. So when you want to play off the string, you don't have to summon a god of spiccato to come down and bless you with the right position for your arm. You do not have to throw the bow at the string to make it bounce. You do not have, a lot of things that I see people doing don't necessarily lead to good results and are unnecessary. So it helps a lot to remember that a staccato stroke is part of a long bow. So where is my arm when I put it in the middle? If I were just going to draw it out to the middle, that's the place it is for staccato. For sautier, it's a very, very small stroke, but the right position of my arm, the right balance of my arm is going to be exactly the same as if I were just drawing it out to here, and then going back and forth very quickly. The bow wants to bounce. You can see it's doing this. But does it mean that suddenly the stroke goes into my wrist and I just sort of flick my wrist around to make the stroke? No. Why? Because we don't play the cello that way in any other facet of bow use. So not that the wrist has no job, but the wrist is a joint. So its job is to be flexible and to allow a transfer of energy. So spiccato is the same thing. If we want the bow to actually leave the string, there are certain things we can do to get the bow to completely bounce off the string. But my arm motion, my arm position, my bow hand, I don't suddenly lift 3 fingers off the stick in order to play spiccato. There's a simplicity and a commonality among these strokes. So I would say let the right hand be the same as it is when you play legato. Let's have one way to hold the bow, not 4 ways to hold the bow, depending on what we're playing. Bow placement is basically, it's where you would be if you drew it out to the point on your bow where it bounces. And then it's just a question of, do we use this mechanism to keep the bow on the string? Or do we go faster until it wants to bounce, but we're keeping it on the string? Or we actually let it bounce. So I hope that answers the question really quickly, but I think we often make these things more complicated than they need to be by thinking that the difference that staccato, spiccato, and sautier are 3 completely different books on the bookshelf, and we need to read up on each one, whereas they're all related to a basic natural way that we use the bow. There are 3 different ways to use the bow, but the basic sense, 3 different results, I guess, but the basic way that we're moving the bow back and forth does not change, or should not change, doesn't have to change. Whoops, the computer almost fell back there. Jason, how are you? I'm working on up bow spiccato and practicing things like subchick and staccato eighth notes per bow scales. Do you have any legendary tips on making fast up bow spiccato sound effortless and musical? No, I don't. Other than the experimentation of just remembering that the articulation of a staccato or a spiccato comes from the hand, and that the basic motion of the arm, if you can see that, it's both up and down. There's an articulation in the hand, and the basic motion of the arm stays the same, if you can. And then there's a wet and a dry version, so it sounds like you've been practicing this. That's the dry version, and then there's the sort of, I call it the wetter version, where the bow actually stops a little bit less. And so when you have command of both of those, the dry and the... Oops, that was a little spastic. You may not be able to hear that. I don't even know if you can hear the difference, but knowing both of those will help you sort of have your choices. Obviously, this is a very specialized stroke that doesn't come up very often in playing, but the same skills that allow us to play a series of spiccato on up bow are skills we can practice in isolation by, exploring the role of the hand and fingers in being able to scoop individual strokes out of the string, which is in essence what this spiccato is doing. The faster the stroke goes, eventually it crosses over into a realm that we would say is, I forget the way Starker used to describe it, but quasi-uncontrolled, where we're actually no longer controlling each individual motion, and it becomes a little bit more of a slightly spastic, but hopefully even motion. So effortless and musical, I would say, conceive it that way and imagine the idea. This is where visualization can help, actually, is to visualize what you look like playing in an effortless and musical way this stroke. Try it a little bit when you don't have the cello in your hand, you know. It's like a beautiful motion will sometimes result in the same thing when we pick up a cello. Good. Linda Ferris, who is your favorite or the most memorable conductor you have worked with? Wow, this is a difficult question, and I will be disappointing right away and say that I cannot narrow it down to just one. Part of the reason is because different conductors do different things well. And another part of the reason is because I'm lucky to play in an orchestra where we have a little bit of an embarrassment of riches. We're lucky to see most of the very best conductors who are out there in the world today, and some who are no longer in the world today. I have enjoyed aspects of, wow, so many. Well, if we just start with our music directors here in Chicago, I was hired by Daniel Barenboim, and during the 7 or 8 years that he was our music director, when I joined the orchestra, I learned a tremendous amount from him. Not so much about cello playing specifically, because he's not a string player, but just about seamless legato and about the real nuances of connections from one note to another. Then after Barenboim, we were lucky to have both Pierre Boulez and Bernard Haitink as sort of interim musical fathers before Riccardo Muti started in 2010. So to do a Verdi opera with Muti is just an unforgettable experience where you think, my goodness, I can't imagine this being any better. So I love that. To do a Mahler symphony with Haitink, for example, it's the same, different repertoire, but it's the same feeling. And Boulez, actually, the types of programs that he conducted of the early 20th century music, French, Stravinsky, the French guys, Bartók, such wonderful repertoire, and was right up his alley. So maybe not a satisfying answer to your question, but it should be good news to all of us that there is not just one favorite conductor wandering the earth these days. There are so many who are wonderful, and we think about it for a second, do we expect ourselves as performers to be equally at home in all the repertoire? Of course not. So it makes sense that conductors are similar. They gravitate to certain things, and Muti, for example, our music director, doesn't really conduct the music of Sibelius, who is one of my very favorite composers, and I love playing his music with others, but for whatever reason, Muti doesn't feel an intense connection to that music, and that's okay, because he does other things so well. Let's see. Let me see if I can find another question here. A follow-up question from our YouTube Live. Is it more natural to breathe in for down bow or breathe out for down bow? Okay. Neither. I think it's helpful to do both. If we're consciously thinking about breathing, we've talked a lot about this hour, which is good. I think just giving ourselves the choice. Obviously, if we're starting something on a very strong down bow, I will almost always choose an exhale. If I'm starting something soft on an on an up bow, often I will also choose an exhale. The reason, this is just my personal reasoning behind this, is that we never forget to inhale. But we do, if we inhale strongly, it's possible to hold our breaths for a shocking amount of time, which obviously is not so great for being open and free. When I think of breathing, I always exhale, and then my body remembers to inhale again. But if we're doing exercises, I think it's why isn't it ultimately better to experience both? Breathing out on a down bow and breathing in on a down bow. Yeah, good. Another one from YouTube Live. How do you subdivide rhythm in your mind? Any exercises or tips that you utilize? That's a good question. I guess in order to subdivide rhythm in our mind, two things have to happen. One is that we have to understand the rhythm that we're playing. And another is that we have to have, I can't remember if this came up in my last chat or not, a very, very strong internal clock. I feel like mine comes from, we want to develop and then learn to trust an internal pulse that is independent from the music that we are playing. So then we can use our arms to play the rhythms while our body very deeply feels the basic pulse or the meter. So we need to start by making those two things independent. Then we can decide whether or not we want to subdivide and why. I find that subdivision is useful, but it can easily go too far, and people who end up subdividing things unnecessarily usually end up feeling the music in, by definition, in smaller and smaller groups, and often it helps just to be able to ultimately feel music and phrases in larger groups, so larger swings, larger pulses. But when around cadences, when the harmonic rhythm speeds up, there are plenty of situations in music when the tempo is changing, a ritardando, for example, then it does help to subdivide. But I'd say, what form that takes is kind of on a case-by-case basis, depending on what's happening in the music. But no specific exercises I can give you, but hopefully that constitutes tips, which is recognize the difference between rhythm and pulse and practice them separately, and then hopefully you can use the skill of subdivision to best advantage whenever you want. Okay. Another one from YouTube. How do you practice awkward chords, such as in the sixth suite with minimal tension? Good question. There is no getting around the fact that when we play a double stop or a triple stop, it requires more strength from the hand. And it often requires that we do something that we try not to do the rest of the time, which is to hold 2 fingers or 3 fingers down at the same time. While it is true that we often have to hold 2 fingers down at once, it's probably not true that we have to hold 3 down at once. Why? Because when we play a 3-note chord on the cello, usually we're rolling it with the bow. So playing, there's a brief moment where I have all 3 of my fingers down, but one of the keys is actually releasing the fingers that aren't needed as soon as possible. Another tip that actually helps is to remember that a tiny bit of movement in the hand, not specifically vibrato, but just making sure that the hand is not rigid. For example, there's that chord in the Allemande, I think it's that guy. So there's an extension in there. There's a 4th on the top. There's a weird position of the finger. So obviously I release the bottom note as soon as possible. And on the top, holding my fingers perfectly still takes more energy and results in more tension than actually just feeling like there's a little supple quality there. Obviously that's independent from the issue of vibrato, but feeling like our hand is supple is also the beginning of allowing ourselves to have a vibrato motion. I guess the other tip would be to make sure that, obviously we don't want to practice too many chords for too long, but to make sure that something related to chord practice is sort of a regular part of your routine, because if we have only enough strength that we need to play the cello, then when we play something like the Sixth Suite, the demands of that are right up at our limit of strength, and we end up risking strains and tension and even injury, those types of things. So do yourself a favor and get yourself in, like an athlete, get yourself in good condition. And if you feel like your hand doesn't quite have the strength, there are exercises at the cello with chords, and even exercises away from the cello to develop the sort of underappreciated strength in our fingers. There are little muscles there that are helpful for that. So hopefully that helps. YouTube live audience. YouTube is going gangbusters today. Greetings from Poland. Could you tell me about unity of hands? If I'm playing piano with my right hand, should I use less gravity with my left hand vibrato? That's a great question. There are times when our hands need to be very much married to each other and very connected. If we're talking about phrasing and vibrato and color and development of a note with the bow that then needs vibrato from the left hand, that's a sense that we very much want our hands to be connected. But there are other ways that are less advantageous, shall we say. So, for example, when the bow moves quickly and we have to shift, does the shift still maintain our normal shifting motion, or does the shift become more angular because the bow moved more angularly? And obviously those are connections that we don't want. And in general, I think the essence of your question has to do with not so much phrase and color shaping the hands together, but maybe exploring ways that the hands are apart. Because if the right hand is playing piano, does that mean that the left hand needs to be lighter? I would say no, or not necessarily. Why? Because there's a certain amount of effort that it takes to push the string down. And I've actually found a little bit the opposite of what you described, which is that in soft playing or in slow playing, being able to clearly drop the finger down with as minimal tension as possible, but a clear sort of ping makes notes pop out. If I don't know that you'll be able to hear the difference here, but if I'm kind of oozing my fingers down and sort of picking them up with very minimal sort of crawly motion, because that's what I'm doing with the bow. But on the other hand, now I'm using a bit more activity from the left hand, and I don't know if you could hear that or not, but I can tell you in the room here, version 2, the notes ping out sort of like bells. They're articulate, and the articulation is clear. So in this sense, our hands don't, not that we want them completely disconnected, but lightness in one hand doesn't necessarily correlate to lightness in the other hand. And even more importantly, heaviness in the bow, playing fortissimo, need not correlate to any more gripping or holding in the left hand. This is the far more common problem, that when we, come down heavy with this side, we do the same thing here and we hold something unnecessarily. So in order to separate those two, we just have to have the curiosity to practice it. Try starting single notes down bow and see how much you need with the left hand, and you might be surprised how light and agile the left hand can be, even while the right hand is engaged in very heavy playing. This is great, this stream of questions. What goes through your head while playing with the orchestra, and how is it different from what you think about while playing solo? That's an interesting question. Now would be the wrong time to say I'm thinking about what's for dinner later, right? No, that's not true. I think it varies in the orchestra, but it's not so different from what I'm doing when I'm playing solo. But one of the key differences in the orchestral experience, as we know, is that somebody else is driving the boat. So our antennae are sort of constantly up, listening to our colleagues around us, but aware of the direction that is coming from the conductor. So that's one basic difference, but I think, I guess another difference is that I'm less aware of my own tone color because I play as part of a section in an orchestra. And so our section sort of becomes one, and of course I hear myself, but I don't hear myself the same way I would if I was playing a Beethoven sonata. And so maybe there's a little bit less direct attention to my individual tone, and more towards sort of the section blend. That's actually maybe the biggest difference. But from a musical standpoint and from a standpoint of being involved in the inner life of the composition, it's the same. If I'm playing a Beethoven sonata, I'm trying to be aware, sort of looking down on the entire form. Say it's a sonata form, where are we in the form? How am I telling the story of what this piece is? And so, of course, playing, Beethoven's 7th Symphony, same key as the A major Beethoven sonata, sonata form, where are we? Are we in the development? Is there musical tension here? How far are we away from home? How are we going to get home? What does it mean to have a recapitulation where we return home triumphantly? In this sense, Beethoven, if we're speaking about Beethoven, he was the same composer, same personality writing this music. So in that case, the experience of musical experience of experiencing his thoughts is very similar in an orchestra as opposed to playing solo. But that's an interesting question. Thank you for that. Another one from YouTube Live. How do you work breathing into your daily technical exercises? Sort of covered this a little bit before, and it's sort of a choice of being aware of breathing. I would say awareness of breath coming in and out of the body and the various ways that we can choose to do that is going to be good whether you're playing a scale, an arpeggio, a long tone, an etude, repertoire. I would stick to, if it's a new concept and you're sort of exploring it, I would say stick to things that are simpler, that don't draw your attention away from the breathing, because then you can give more and more of your focus to it. Good. Moving right along. Leslie says, what is the most favorite orchestra work you've ever played? Oh boy, I'll be a disappointment here and refer us back to the question about who is my favorite conductor. It's impossible to say, and that's good because there is such an enormous wealth of wonderful repertoire with different languages, different messages. I mentioned Sibelius earlier as being one of my favorite composers. His 7th Symphony is probably one of the 10 pieces I would take to a desert island if I could only choose 10. I think it says more in 22 minutes than some Wagner operas say in 5 hours. There, I said it out loud. Yeah, it's impossible to say because, yeah, it just is. But we're lucky. It's an embarrassment of riches. Jennifer Bailey from the Netherlands. Apart from the second movement of Beethoven 5, which excerpts do you think every aspiring cellist should work on? I'm going to assume that auditions it's been a while since I've seen an excerpt list from a European orchestra, but I'm going to assume that the excerpts are similar to the ones we use over here. I would say the standards that come up most often, and I'm going to forget one, but besides Beethoven 5, Brahms' Second Symphony, the second movement, Brahms' Third Symphony, the third movement. There are a couple of lesser known excerpts from Brahms' Fourth Symphony. Sometimes the Brahms Haydn variations comes up, but maybe those are in a slightly less category. Debussy, La Mer, the big cello moment from the first movement. Mendelssohn, the Scherzo from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Some work of Richard Strauss, either Don Juan or Ein Heldenleben, or a little bit less often, Also Sprach Zarathustra or Till Eulenspiegel. So, yeah, that's a good half dozen to start with. Beethoven, 2 Brahms, the Debussy, the Mendelssohn, and some Strauss. That will keep you relatively covered. Okay, they keep coming. I can stay a few minutes beyond the time. I see we're just coming up over an hour now, but if you guys are up for it, I will stay a bit longer. How do you use the thumb in your right hand? Where do you place it on the bow, and how do you manage tension? Good question. I saw part of, I think it was Brinton's, was it Brinton or David Ying? One of the recent chats where this issue came up. Very quickly, I believe that the heart of a good bow hand is a relationship between the thumb and the second finger. Why? Because when we hang our hands like this, the thumb naturally falls, at least mine does, somewhere right around here, right? So try this exercise with me. Any of you who are listening right now live, squeeze the thumb to the first finger. Feels good. Second finger. Feels good. Squeeze it to the third finger. You can feel a little bit of tension there because the thumb is reaching. And then squeeze it to your pinky. Worst one of all, because there's, it's reaching across the hand. So why can't we have thumb and 1 be the basis of a good bow grip? Well, because if thumb and 1 are right above each other, we can't push the bow down into the string. It's only because of some opposition of up and down that we can flex the bow. So therefore, 2 becomes the ideal candidate. So thumb, I keep my bows rehaired short so that there's a little pocket right here between the frog and the leather. In the warm weather, when our hair stretches out, sometimes this distance can get really long on some people's bows. And so the thumb actually doesn't have a nice little pocket there. So if the thumb goes there, 2 ends up being right kind of at the other side, on the edge of mine falls on the edge of the ferrule here, the silver part. And then where do the other fingers go? They go exactly where they would go if I held my hand in the air, right? Not this, not this, just this. That's it. It feels powerful. It feels like the hand is a unit because the hand feels like a unit this way. The minute we do funny things with our hand without the bow, it doesn't feel like a unit anymore. So making cello playing like real life. So how do we release tension? That was the other part of your question. When we come into the frog, when do we have an opportunity to release tension? We do not have an opportunity when we're out at the tip. Why? Because the thumb is holding up the bow and the weight of the arm at that point. So when we have the opportunity to release tension is when we come into the frog. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but there is a moment when we change bow that we have the possibility to enjoy a bit of flexibility in the thumb. And so we have to choose that. We have to get used to the feeling. But if we don't find that, then we lose our only opportunity to habitually release tension in the thumb. I don't know if Paul Katz is still on this thread or how he teaches this concept, if it's similar or different from what I just mentioned. But anybody who's telling you that we can play with the thumb tension-free in the right hand is lying to you, because we, by definition, have to increase pressure and tension as we travel to the tip. The key is what happens when we come back to the frog and we have a chance to release it. Good. Let me go back here. Is there any good technique that can help in producing a good vibrato? I find it hard to produce a clear vibrato tone. Does the left hand or finger posture affects? Okay. Good question. This is going to be another nutshell version of vibrato, because it's a very complicated, in a good way it's complicated, because there's a lot of ways to produce nice vibrato and to color our sound. There are two basic motions. There's the pumping motion, which is vertical motion this way with the forearm, and then there is the rocking motion, which is similar to turning a doorknob. You notice what I had to do with my hand in order to get these two motions. In order to get the rocking motion isolated, I made my hand exactly square. In order to get the pumping motion, I angle my hand this way. Then, so one becomes this motion, one becomes this motion. The rocking motion comes from the back of the hand, basically, the wrist. At least that's the way it feels. This one is vertical and comes more from the forearm. So how you produce vibrato depends upon whether you play with an angled hand or not. If you play with a square hand, the rocking or the pumping motion is off limits. It's not necessarily a bad thing. There are some cellists, prominent cellists, who play with a very square hand down low. I do not. So there's this motion. The key to me is that if we have a pumping motion, we can add, when we want a very rich vibrato, we can add some rock to it. So we don't learn these two motions so that we just use them in isolation. It helps to understand both of them so that we can actually use them in combination to produce as many different vibratos as possible. So for me, it starts by understanding that and experimenting with, being able to produce the pumping motion, being able to know what it feels like to rock the hand. And then eventually, once we understand those, we get back to the point I was talking about earlier, which is that your ears guide you. If you need a richer vibrato, you're going to need to let your hand rock more. Sometimes in order to get a really deep, rich vibrato, it almost feels ridiculous in the left hand because we're not used to that. Especially down on the C string. If I try to vibrate, with just a little bit of a pump, I don't know if you can hear that, but the vibrato is not changing the sound at all. The C string needs both. It needs some back and forth in the hand. So, that's sort of the fastest way I can explain that. Why would somebody play with an angled hand versus a square hand? Everybody plays with an angled hand up high, and as you're now learning, I'm an advocate of simplicity in playing. One way to hold the bow, one angle of the left hand to the fingerboard. So because nobody plays square up here, if I want to keep this similar, so that when I go over this part of the cello, I don't change my hand angle. So to me, that's a level of simplicity that I like in playing. So I use the angle down low, and my vibrato adjusts accordingly. Great. We are moving right along here. I've got just a couple more minutes. There's a question here about creating a character in a 20th century. This has to do with what's our learning process really for a piece, and how do we understand what the composer was trying to do and into what form they put their thoughts. So this gets back to my sort of fantasy that one day we would all be able to learn a piece long before we pick up the cello. I was just talking about this a couple days ago, that we actually study the score, maybe listen to a recording, but actually really study the way that the piece is constructed and understand it that way before we ever get our grubby paws on the cello and say, what fingerings work, what bowings work, like I want to make these sounds. Think about it for a second. If we do that too soon, what exactly are our hands trying to do? something general, just to sort of get the lay of the land with the piece, but wouldn't it be amazing if we devoted a little bit more time to the conception of the work and then picked up the instrument? Maybe now that the world has slowed down a little bit, we actually might have the luxury of experimenting with learning that way. And I think it's, the key is to understand what the composer's intention was. Like, why bother putting notes on paper to begin with? What's the message of the piece? And then, obviously, character and color come out of your answers to those questions. Just a couple more. How do I manage the opening of Bruckner 7? Very calmly and with some deep breathing, because that's a deep breathing kind of piece. That's a beautiful melody, and if you're having to learn it for either, whether it's to play in the orchestra or as an excerpt, use it as the wonderful tone production opportunity that it is. It's such a beautiful melody. It lies well on the cello. So many opportunities to develop the long notes and keep them as part of the phrase. It's just be inspired by what the composer was doing. Take your time with the eighth notes. Do not compress the eighth notes. Do not compress the eighth notes. In general, do not compress fast notes. Nobody asked this question today, but it's a scourge sometimes that the fastest notes in a phrase, whatever they are, get compressed rhythmically, when in reality, often those notes are have the greatest possibility for expression. One more from Bolivia. Wow. Can I say which is my preference, a wood bow or carbon fiber? Both. I have played wonderful carbon fiber bows, truly wonderful. And I actually own a couple of them, and wood bows as well. I play more of the time the wood bow, but it's just a personal preference. And if you find a carbon fiber bow that sounds better on your cello than a wood bow, then by all means use it, because the best carbon fiber bows are fantastic. Good. I think we might have actually hit all of the questions. I hope I didn't skip anybody. I've got to wrap it up now, but thanks for the great questions, and it's a pleasure to see all of you, and keep your inspiration going during this rather strange time that we're in. It won't last forever. Nothing does. And do some breathing experiments, all of you, and see what you come up with. All right? Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.